And he looked at me and said, "You mean Net Gator?" And I said, "Well, I'm so glad I told you that story so I could pronounce it correctly." I have a pattern. One of my goals this year as a knitter is to learn to follow patterns. I've always made up my own patterns, just sort of started a project, and I would just see where it would go. And so this year I'm learning to follow patterns. The Net Gator pattern, this is probably the third time I've tried to follow it and failed. But the thing about knitting is you don't really fail. You just turn it into something else, or you unravel it and you just keep going. And so that's the moral I'll start with. And today I'm just going to talk kind of generally and hope to give you some time to ask questions or talk. So since I started with that point about how you might start in one direction and go in another, I'm going to shift to a poem I wrote as I was preparing my outline for today's talk. I thought, well, I have a couple of poems that have knitting in them. Maybe I should write another, 2 or 3. Oh, wouldn't that be great? Just have lots of knitting poems, within a week. And so this poem began as a poem about knitting, and it had a lost gray cap in it and a really pretty gray scarf, and this sort of wonder at where the lost gray hat ended up. Anyway, in the revision, there's no hat. There's nothing in here that would let you know that it's a poem about knitting. But I wrote it with that impulse, and I guess I'm grateful to all of you for giving me that chance to think of a new poem. Anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit, read some poems and stuff like that. This is called Last Walk. And remember, it's a poem about knitting. On our last walk, we paused at a kiwi vine, dormant that time of year, and yet verdant with desire for spring and fruit and butterflies. Its mate was dead. The male of this species more fragile than the female. Its brittle vines already compost, where a new vine would lay, we like to think. Come a trip to the nursery in town, come June. This is not symbolic, I said to my friend, who would die within the week. I don't think he laughed, but I did, nervous. My hardy mate steps faltering like a vine without roots. Okay, so the thing about writing poetry, which is what I do, not as much as I knit. Sometimes I wish I'd be obsessive about my writing as much as about my knitting, is that you just sort of start and see where it goes. I learned to knit when I was 6 years old. My friend Jane Daniels' mother taught me. Jean Daniels sat me down. I guess I got something for Christmas, and my mother was so busy. Jean Daniels taught me how to knit, and I sort of went from there and just knitted scarves for years and years, and more scarves, and then learned to sort of turn a scarf into a hat. To summarize that very quickly, I would say I would go in and out of knitting, but knitting for me in the beginning, and perhaps even now, was all about love. And so I think it's neat that you chose that song to begin with, because when I first knitted, it was to knit things for people that I loved, and I guess I still do that. I pulled my knitting needles out when I lived in Austin, where people didn't really need scarves all that often, to make a scarf for a friend, and made a scarf for my brothers, for my father, all these different people. And so I guess knitting for me began as a way to show affection and love. And Madame Defarge, y'all know, in Tale of Two Cities, knits for the opposite reason. She has this secret code that she knits in the people who are to be killed. And I like to think that I do a little bit of the opposite, so that when I give something I've knitted, it's knitted in some kind of special care, even for people I don't know, because I knit so much. I've started knitting for people I don't know, hoping to pass on that kind of affection and love. And so I've made scarves for lots and lots of people, as I said, my fathers, my brothers, my friends, my husbands. And, I will say will be after my husband moved out. A couple years ago, I found the scarf I made for him in the trash. I was going through the trash to see what I could recycle versus really throw away. There was this gorgeous scarf with artisan wool and stuff, and so I pulled it out and washed it, and I wear it. It's not in the dump. So let me begin. Knitting can work as a way for that, but it's also kind of occupational therapy. So knitting would be a way to say, I have knitted this scarf for you. Can't you see? I love you dearly. And so, but it became, of course, more than that. Stephanie Pearl McPhee, a knitter/philosopher, has said that knitters just can't watch TV without doing something else. Knitters just can't wait in line. Knitters just can't sit waiting at the doctor's office. Knitters need knitting to add a layer of interest in other less constructive ways. And I'm a fidgety person, I think. I look at knitting as multitasking. If it got really intensely philosophical or psychological, I might say, well, it also gives me a reason to just be sitting somewhere, and I always feel I need to be doing something, which I'll talk about later, which it can be a negative sort of thing. So I've always knitted in different places. Last month was Knit in Public month, and so people were supposed to take photographs of themselves knitting someplace in public and send it out into the world. And I started thinking about all the places I've sat to knit, and where and when. In college, the president of an organization I was in when I was one of the officers got annoyed because I was knitting at one of our meetings. I think even in college I thought meetings might be a little tedious, even that I could knit and function at the same time, but I quit knitting there. And I remember knitting between chess moves at home and driving people nuts because my family took chess seriously. I don't have a game brain, I don't think. But so I think knitting between chess moves could drive. How many of you do that? So it's something to think about. It will drive your opponent nuts. And so I've always, now I will knit at faculty meeting, at the laundromat, here, there, and everywhere. I will knit. I have knitted all over. I'll talk about more. Anyway, so I moved from knitting, well, actually, I think I'll talk about that now. Let's see where I have knitted. I've got this sort of outline. Home, in the car, but it's best not while driving, laundromat, and hospitals. My mother was in Grace Healthcare of Abingdon for a little more than 5 years, and that's sometimes I think that's when I took up my knitting, but I actually took it up again when Ann Richmond, some of you may remember, was a member here, was diagnosed with cancer. That's when I went in the basement and found my old needles and started knitting and made her a sparkly, beautiful shawl very quickly. And that's when I started knitting again in faculty meetings, because I knew I had a deadline to complete that shawl before it was her time to go. And so I just knitted and knitted and knitted. And I haven't really stopped since I made Ann's shawl, which got me back to knitting again. I knitted last year at an ultra running event. I don't do ultra running, but my son does, and so I used to spend a lot of time sitting around waiting. And so I figure if I'm knitting, it's okay, and people will come and talk and share their knitting. And so I was sitting there knitting, and a runner, one of the ranking runners behind me, turned around, and he was knitting a cloche. He called it a cloche for his girlfriend for Christmas, this really elaborate pattern. And then he showed me these gloves that he had designed to sort of deal with the way thumbs really are versus the way a lot of gloves are made. And so we had a long talk about knitting, because he is an ultra runner who usually comes in, first or third. He spends a lot of time sitting around waiting too. And so you'll find knitters wherever you go. Wherever I go, though, I often find people who will ask me if it's crocheting, say, is that crocheting or is that knitting? And people will say, 9 times out of 10, if they're not knitters, I can't do that. As if it's something you can't do, the way some people say, I can't do math, I can't do, English grammar or whatever. And so then I get to do my little pep talk about how I probably should carry around extra needles and teach people how to do it. The title of this talk, one last place I knitted, I guess I'll read this poem. I have just 3 poems. It's called Knitting in the Chemo Room. And so that was a place that I knitted a good bit. And it gave me something to do and kept me occupied. But one day I was sitting there thinking, gosh, everything's all tangled up. This is so interesting, and really the body is nothing but this network of, yarn, if you get really metaphorical. So here's this poem before I shift gears. So, Knitting in the Chemo Room. On my lap, purple yarn and plastic tubes, a tangled web of medicine, the cord for my headphones. Knitting is necessary as Herceptin, Taxotere, Carboplatin, sodium chloride. Inside my head, antique music boxes play, their melodies innocent of the detritus of cancer. I listen to every note each time I sit, imagine myself inside a box, this music box, wheels turning steel into brain waves I call infusion 2. My hands are sometimes steel, my feet on the recliner moving with a beat. Most times I hold on to knitting needles that are nothing like the small needles that stick me, their filament growing in my hands instead of in a network of veins. Chemotherapy pushes in, wool pulls out, and the dancing girl inside my head keeps spinning to music composed by people who died before I was born. I love antique music box music, and so that's what I'm talking about there. I have it on my iPod. And so that's where I knit. But the why I knit is probably more interesting. So I said I began because I made things for people I love, but you run out of people you love and care for. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But you end up, I would just mail knitted caps in random ways to people who were special to me, but didn't know that well. And so I realized I had to sort of push myself, and I started doing what a lot of people call knitting ministry. And so if you take anything from today, perhaps it's the idea that all it takes is one person and some yarn to do a knitting ministry. There are organized knitting ministries you can Google and find out about online and where to send your stuff. But you can also just, it's probably one of the easiest service projects a person can do, because you can do it in solitude, alone, and I'm kind of a solitary person. So I started a couple of years ago, which is kind of interesting because of knitting in the chemo room. I thought I would make the cutest chemo caps in the whole world. And so I started in soft, and I didn't have cancer, but I'd known whole lots of people who had cancer, and I just thought it would be something I could do, so I was making these very colorful cotton chemo caps and made lots of them, and now and then I'd post them pictures on Facebook before I would donate them, and then people would ask me to make a cap for a special friend who was sick, and once picked out some really lovely, I guess, Angora to make, probably the most expensive hat ever made, with someone who bought the yarn for me to make a cap for a friend. And so I made, dozens of chemo caps. Sometimes think there's one still in the wig room at the cancer center, but I haven't gone in to look that close, but it looks like something I would have made that's still there. But what I realized, after I did that for a long time, once I myself had cancer, was I just didn't want to make another chemo cap. I didn't want to wear a chemo cap. I just didn't want to. And I also learned, since I was sitting in the chemo room once a week for almost a year, and for a year almost every week, that there were many, many loving people making chemo caps. Many, many people out there making chemo caps. There will never be a shortage of chemo caps, and I would look at them in the basket and think, those are so pretty. But I never wore one. So I still kept knitting and knitting. So I decided that each year I'd pick a charity and send off my hats. I just knit all year and then collect the stuff and then pick a place and send it. Sometimes I'll get advice from friends about where to send it, but there are places, women's shelters and homeless shelters, places for people with AIDS. And so my theory, when I make these hats, which are wool, all woolen and really nice, pretty wool, is that, and colorful and lovely, even if they started out as a net gaiter, is that people deserve something pretty, that the children, this year I'm sort of focusing on more on infant hats and children's hats and branching out to scarves and also headbands and just a variety of things, because it's just fun to do, and it's a way of sending out a different kind of love into the world. It's sort of hard for me to talk about, too, in a way, because I've always believed that service should be sort of a private thing that you do, and so I did it for so long I didn't really talk about it, but I'm talking about it for this brief moment so that you can have permission to do it too. And it's something people do care about to help, and with the wool. The thing about wool is it lasts forever, Eventually, a wool cap will just get passed down, and then somebody else can unravel it, or a bird can turn it into a nest. It can become anything. Knitting can become anything. So knitting, I've said I'm a fidgety person. I also like to do something with that, so I make all of these little things and then I give them away, and so that's sort of a loop, and you might think that's selfless, but really it can be a little bit selfish to feel like you're doing this for yourself as much as for other people, because knitting, sometimes you have to put down the knitting. If knitting is a meditative practice, it can also become kind of an obsession. And so the other day I was watching Downton Abbey. I finally watched that on Netflix on the second hottest day of the year, several episodes. I made myself put down my knitting needles because I know that anything can become a crutch. You can knit. And you always, if I start doing something too much, I wonder what I'm not doing instead. And so Elizabeth Zimmerman, another sort of knitter philosopher, says, properly practiced knitting soothes the troubled spirit, and it doesn't hurt the untroubled spirit either. But sometimes you just sort of need to put down the knitting. And I think that, one reason I knit, this is the negative I said I'd talk about, is you all have heard the idle hands or the devil's workshop. You've heard that. You grew up with that. So, I think I have that in the back of my head, So, and I have to talk back to that and say, well, idle hands are a way of sitting and being meditative and just sort of clearing your mind of everything. So sometimes you have to learn to be idle, and sort of combine meditation and service. So this summer, what I have been doing is knitting up loose ends, which is a lot of fun. One thing knitters do universally is buy too much yarn. I think I love knitting because of the colors and the texture of the yarn. One of my brothers travels the world, and wherever he goes in the U.S. or anywhere, he finds artisan wool to give me, and so I have some lovely wool to knit in the winter or any time anyway. So I always have too much yarn. I buy it or somebody gives it to me. And then you have leftovers. So this summer I thought, what if I just knitted up all the loose ends, all these little tiny skeins of yarn, and that, I think, became a way of dealing with loose ends just in general. I mean, it's obvious to say if you're knitting up loose ends, you're dealing with the loose ends of your life and just sort of making less clutter and making more sense of things. So knitting up loose ends probably made me think about all kinds of different things. It also made me think about knitting for myself. And I've talked about knitting for others. I knit for people I love. I knit for strangers I love. I probably knit for people I wouldn't love because, I don't know who takes the hats. But I've always had trouble finishing anything that I make for myself. And I'm thankful to my Knitters group for encouraging me to make myself a scarf this year. I bought this beautiful, beautiful pink and gray and lovely yarn to make something for a friend. And it was just a lot of beautiful yarn. And really, I wanted it for myself. A lot of times I'll buy something I want a whole lot and give it to somebody else. And so that's what I was going to do. But I learned that it's possible to make something for yourself and actually finish it. And if it weren't 100 degrees, I would have worn it today. But so yeah, I guess in that sense, yeah, I'm saying if you're knitting for other people because you love them and you want to show love, you also need to learn to love yourself, which is a lesson some of us learn even late in life. And so knitting is like, you can think of it as using prayer beads. It's like color therapy. It's like a meditative practice. It's all of these different kinds of things. It's fun. And when you're done, you have something really pretty. So I'm gonna read another poem before I close and ask you to talk and ask questions. So this is the other poem I had about knitting, and it's called Nest. I collect birds' nests, but not too many. I mean, the house isn't overflowing. But I don't take them from the birds, but if I find them, on the grass, there it is. And so this is called Nest. But also scatter here in the woods and yarn and bits and pieces of just things that birds might use. So scattered throughout my house are a number of bird nests, as if I picked up each specimen and brought it home to identify. I've never studied a single one, not in the way I have studied wildflowers or the way I have learned to call birds. Abandoned to a bookshelf or a table or even the piano, these nests are not like all the rocks I have lined up on the mantelpiece or the bowl with every piece of coral I have found in my entire life. They are not like seeds growing in jars. They are just little bird nests with bits of stick and moss and mud and hair or yarn I have seen before. These old nests seem so sturdy, even after a wind has thrown them down on the ground at the feet of my woods, bringing some of my loose threads back to me, along with stray hairs I tossed in the woods after it fell out of my head, because I am not superstitious, and birds are nothing if not crafty. So that's another poem, sort of about knitting, but not about knitting. And you think about it, a bird's nest is knitted together. To knit is to tie knots. And when you think about something that's knitted, all you are doing is creating a long, elaborate knot with one long, endless, almost endless piece of yarn. And so whatever it is just one long piece of yarn. That's something good to remember when you're learning to follow patterns. The pattern, the gator pattern, is one I'm making my son a vest. It's a really complicated pattern, and I can't mess up. So I'm going to depend on friends to help me through with that. So I guess I'll end up by saying it's never too late to learn to follow a pattern. As I said, I've always knitted intuitively, even if I made like a vest. I could make a vest. It might not fit me, but I would just sort of look at something and make it. And so I guess what's the point of all this before I shut up? What's the point of all of this? I guess I'd like for you to ask me some questions, and maybe that will help. So I'm going to pause. Please ask a question or make an observation.
You said you stopped knitting when you had cancer. When did you?
I kept knitting. I just stopped knitting chemo caps. Oh, yeah. I stopped knitting a little bit, probably when I had my son. I was running around. Because when Ann Richmond was diagnosed with her cancer, I went in the basement and I found my needles. I even found yarn I'd bought in Austin, Texas that was still strong, and still have some of that, waiting for something special to knit out of it. But yeah, I didn't stop. I just shifted what I wanted to knit. I just didn't want to make, I won't say I'll never make another chemo cap, but I'm making other things. Yep. So I never stopped. So